This video will walk through some of the processes that we as intuitive psychologists engage in. Much of what is covered in this video is discussed in readings 7.1 and 7.3. I've used an asterisk to indicate terms that are not in those readings, so you may want to watch for those in the video. An intuitive psychologist is really anyone who attempts to understand the world around them, including being able to describe, predict, and explain the behavior of other people and themselves. In other words, you and I are intuitive psychologists. Humans are generally driven to understand the world around us because in understanding it, we gain a sense of certainty and control. The problem with the intuitive psychologist, or rather, the problem we all encounter as humans trying to understand the world, is that we make some systematic mistakes along the way. So, as Ross suggests, to understand the impact of the intuitive psychologist, we must examine their methods. For starters, intuitive psychologists develop what are called concepts to organize their understanding and knowledge. Concepts can help us group pieces of information in a meaningful way. There are generally two types of concepts, natural and artificial. Natural concepts are created through direct and indirect experiences and tend to involve rather subjective criteria for what is included within the concept and what is not. For example, depending on where I grew up, I may have a different way of thinking about what is and what is not a snowstorm. Additionally, I can still understand the concept of snowstorm even if I never personally experience one. I could rely on the experience of others or stories to help me understand something I've never directly experienced. On the other hand, an artificial concept provides relatively well-defined and agreed-upon criteria for what fits and what doesn't. The field of math provides a wide range of artificial concepts. For example, a circle's circumference is 2 times pi times the radius, or distance from the midpoint of the circle to the edge, and its area is pi times the radius squared. Beyond natural and artificial concepts, intuitive psychologists use prototypes to create exemplars of objects and ideas. For example, if I asked you to think of a fruit, you might be inclined to think of a banana, or grapes, or an apple, or an orange. Whatever pops into your head quickly and easily demonstrates your exemplar of what a fruit is. Such prototypes are often shaped by our personal experiences along with our culture. To organize those concepts and prototypes, we rely on schemas. Schemas cluster together related concepts and may include relevant prototypes as well. There are many types of schemas, including role schemas, which bring together our assumptions about what a person does in a given role or position. For instance, we may have certain assumptions about what a teacher does. There are also event schemas, sometimes called cognitive scripts, which structure the steps we engage in during basic routine actions. You likely have an event schema which outlines the basic steps you take to get ready each morning. That event schema may or may not involve picking up a cup of coffee. At least, I know mine does. Finally, a concept hierarchy can serve to connect concepts and/or schemas to illustrate relations between broader aspects of our knowledge and more specific details. Here's a really basic concept hierarchy as an example. You can see that social and behavioral sciences is the broader schema, and within that broader mental representation, we might include specific fields like sociology, psychology, and economics, and frankly, many others. We could take this even further, and within each field, list specific subdisciplines, just as we did for psychology. You get the idea. By the way, using concept hierarchies to study can be a great way to thoughtfully process and organize all of the information you're learning within a class. Why not try it? Although concepts, prototypes, schemas, and concept hierarchies are helpful for organizing what we already know, what about what we don't know yet? Turns out, the intuitive psychologist has a few strategies for collecting new information. One of the least efficient of these problem-solving strategies is called trial and error. It involves randomly attempting solutions until we find the right one. It means we may have to try out a few bad ideas and discard them before we get the information we need. If we are looking for something more systematic, we can use an algorithm, which outlines a step-by-step process for solving problems. One example of an algorithm might be a recipe. Using a recipe as an algorithm helps us learn a new process we may not already know. And trust me, you don't want to try to bake bread for the first time by using trial and error. It's not only a lot of time wasted, but a lot of ingredients wasted. The final strategy we'll be covering that helps intuitive psychologists solve problems is called heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts, so they are quicker than the trial and error process. They aren't quite as systematic as algorithms, but they do employ basic rules to help us make decisions. We do need to be careful with heuristics, though. Just like a shortcut you might take while navigating your physical environment, mental shortcuts could save you on time, or could get you very, very lost. In other words, heuristics are not foolproof strategies for gathering new information, and can lead to some common pitfalls that intuitive psychologists engage in. So let's look at that next. One problem an intuitive psychologist runs into is the issue of perceptual sets. This speaks to our tendency to want to perceive things in a certain way. Think of a perceptual set as a filter through which all of the outside world must pass before we make any judgments about it. Ever hear the idea of seeing the world through rose-colored glasses? Yeah, that speaks to the idea of perceptual sets. Our personality, cultural background, existing knowledge, recent experiences, and motivations all can shape how we perceive the present moment, demonstrating use of a perceptual set. It also means that the reality we construct in our mind is not identical to the reality anyone else creates in their mind. And these constructions are not necessarily accurate representations of how reality in fact is. Perceptual sets may serve as filters, causing us to perceive the world in certain ways, but mental sets speak more to how we approach solving a problem. Be careful not to mix these two terms up, given they both include the word set at the end. A mental set speaks to our tendency to want to reuse strategies that have been successful in the past. This keeps us from seeing new and potentially better ways of doing things. For example, you may have study strategies that you developed throughout your earlier education, and they may have served you well. However, continuing to rely only on those old strategies without considering that they may not be the most effective strategies for college gets you stuck in a mental set. Likewise, just as a mental set keeps you from seeing new strategies for approaching problems, functional fixedness keeps you from seeing alternative or new uses for existing objects. For example, you'd be surprised at the wide range of uses of binder clips. Just Google life hacks and binder clips if you don't believe me. In both cases, mental sets and functional fixedness block creativity. And just as mental sets and functional fixedness get us stuck in our thinking, anchoring bias occurs when we focus too heavily on a single aspect of a decision. This prevents us from seeing other aspects of the decision that may be relevant and important. For example, if I'm looking for a house to rent, I don't only want to think about the cost of rent itself. I need to consider a whole host of other information before I make a final choice. But if I only rely on that single piece of the puzzle, the anchoring bias can lead me to make a poor housing choice. Anchoring bias may be more about making choices for my future, but how does the intuitive psychologist think about the past? It turns out that the intuitive psychologist, and that means to say all of us, tend to assume that events are more predictable once we know the outcome. For instance, when we know that the quarterback has thrown an interception, we assume it was obvious that the interception was going to happen. How did the quarterback not know? When we look back at history, we as intuitive psychologists can get pretty judgy when we engage in hindsight bias. But remember, hindsight is indeed 20/20. Looking back into the past, things can appear much clearer than they are in the present. With the hindsight bias, we can often feel superior to others because we knew what the outcome was going to be all along. How smart are we? The confirmation bias has a similar effect. When we engage in the confirmation bias, we seek out information that supports our beliefs, thus proving us right. At the same time, we disregard or discount information that might be inconsistent with our beliefs because it makes us feel like we might be wrong, and that feels bad. No matter where you stand in terms of politics, there are many cases of people engaging in confirmation bias. No matter what our beliefs are, we want to find what fits in with what we know, because then we get to be right, and that feels pretty good. Speaking of fitting in, we have the tendency to focus on what fits in with our existing knowledge or schemas. This is called the representative bias. If new information fits in with what we know, we quickly accept it without question. But if there is information that doesn't fit, we tend to be more inclined to scrutinize it. This helps facilitate a process called assimilation. We'll talk more about that cognitive process later in the semester, so no worries about getting it down now. One example of relying on the representative bias occurs when we use stereotypes. For instance, if I tell you Alex likes to play basketball, you likely will employ a stereotype to begin to create an image of Alex, including Alex's height and gender. But using stereotypes is not purely about the representative bias. In some cases, our stereotypes consist of knowledge that is readily available to us, potentially because of what we see in the media or hear from people around us. Relying heavily on only information that is readily available means we are engaging in the availability bias, or sometimes called the availability heuristic. Unfortunately, what tends to be most readily available to us is the stuff we already know. So, much like the mental set and functional fixedness, the availability bias gets us stuck on a sort of mental treadmill, working really hard to go absolutely nowhere. Altogether, we've discussed several mechanisms that help the intuitive psychologist organize their current understanding, strategies for exploring what is unknown, and potential pitfalls that can often have the effect of preserving existing knowledge as it is. If you have any questions about these concepts, review the video, look over the readings 7.1 and 7.3, or check in with the instructor.